They say that some stories are whispered through time, not to be shouted or solved, but to be sat beside. This is one of those stories, a quiet mystery older than memory, deeper than any grave, and still alive in the wind that moves across the Mongolian steppe. You won't hear its answer in museums, or find its ending on any map. It lives in the silence between things, in the folds of the hills, in the hush of early morning, before the world wakes. It is the story of a man who once ruled more of the earth than anyone before or since, and yet when he died, chose to vanish. No golden tomb, no monument, no path leading to his rest. Just a promise, kept by generations, that some truths should remain unspoken. This is not a tale of discovery. It is a journey into the space that mystery makes. A meditation on stillness, memory, and the kind of power that lingers not in what is seen, but in what is left untouched. And so, we begin. Not at a destination, but at the edge of a question. We begin not to find, but to remember. We begin in silence. The wind begins its song long before the stars rise. It whistles across the ancient grasslands of Mongolia, a place where the sky feels too wide for any one story and the earth too old for any one name. Here the hills are soft with memory. The rivers curl like threads through the valleys, winding toward no destination, only movement, as if they too are searching for something that has been forgotten. You are not in any particular century, not in a specific moment. You are simply here, drifting. The past stretches all around you like fog, gentle, indistinct, and endless. Somewhere in this vast emptiness, beneath layers of soil and silence, lies a secret. Not just any secret, but the final resting place of one of the most powerful men who ever lived. Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire, the unifier of tribes, the breaker of kingdoms, the whisper in every frightened merchant's ear. And yet, in death, a silence more complete than any battlefield. We know he died in 1227, and yet we don't know where he was buried, not truly, not certainly, not in any way that can be proven, touched, or excavated. And for nearly 800 years, that silence has held. But how can someone so vast vanish so completely? That is where our journey begins. Not with his death, but with the long and quiet art of forgetting. The deliberate kind, the sacred kind, the kind where forgetting is an act of loyalty. Let us walk slowly into that forgetting. Long before Temujin became known as Genghis Khan, he was a boy of the steppes. He lived not in palaces, but in felt yurts, not with servants, but with clan and hardship. The Mongolian plateau was his cradle, and it was vast and cold and merciless. But it was also rich with unspoken rules, rules of kinship, of honor, of survival. To understand why his burial became a mystery, we must understand the way Mongols viewed death, not with monuments, not with statues, but with the wind and the ground and the silence that follows. In the world of the steppe, death was not the end, but a return to nature, to the spirits, to the eternal sky. The Mongols did not raise great tombs or carve stone names into mountain faces. They believed in secrecy, in simplicity, and in keeping the sacred untouched. Burial grounds were hidden. Graves were unmarked. To disturb the dead was to risk angering the ancestors. This belief was not unique to Genghis. It was embedded in the culture of his people. But with him, it became something even more guarded. Because to the Mongols, Genghis Khan was not merely a ruler. He was the embodiment of heaven's will. And heaven's secrets are not to be shouted, but whispered. When he died, likely from injuries after falling from a horse, it is said that his body was returned quietly to Mongolia. No grand funeral, no public tomb. His death was kept secret until long after it occurred. There are tales, of course, many tales, conflicting, hazy, always secondhand. One says that he was buried near the Onon River, in the Khenti Mountains, a place sacred to his family. Another says that 1,000 horsemen trampled the ground above his grave to erase all trace of digging. Still others claim that those who buried him were killed, and that those who killed them were also killed. In a long, grim chain of silence, some stories go even further, saying a forest was planted over his grave, or that a river was diverted to flow above it. Do you feel the quiet yet? Not a quiet born of forgetting, but one of fierce protection. A cultural reverence so deep, it hides its own memory, and the odd thing is, it worked. For all our modern tools, our satellites and scanners, our thirst for discovery, no one has found it. Not definitively, not unmistakably. It's as if the land itself refuses to speak. But why? Why would an empire that spanned from the Pacific Ocean to the edge of Europe not build a monument? Why would no one carve his name in the stone? To understand that, you must understand how the Mongols measured greatness. They did not leave behind marble statues. They left behind open land, free for herds to roam. They left behind clear skies, where hawks could soar. They left behind silence, not out of absence, but out of awe. The grave of Genghis Khan was never meant to be found. It was meant to be remembered by forgetting. Even in the centuries that followed, when his descendants carved vast empires, built cities, and ruled from golden thrones, the location of his tomb remained a closely guarded secret. Over time, entire generations passed with no certainty. Oral traditions grew faint. Maps shifted. Names changed. The steppe swallowed its secret whole. And yet, the curiosity never left. In the 20th century, Western archaeologists began to take an interest, especially during the 1920s and 30s, when stories of the lost tomb of Genghis Khan began appearing in newspapers and journals. But politics made exploration difficult. Mongolia was, at different times, a protectorate, a communist ally, a closed society. Excavations were halted, maps were restricted, and the descendants of the Mongol people were, understandably, protective. Because in their eyes, this wasn't a treasure hunt, it was desecration. Even today, some Mongolian scholars warn against looking. They say that to disturb Genghis Khan's grave is to invite unrest, not just spiritual, but cultural. It would strip the sacred from the soil. It would turn reverence into spectacle. And so, while some search with drones and satellites, others kneel quietly beside ancient trees and murmur prayers to the wind. What would you do if you found it? Would you dig? Would you publish it? Or would you let it sleep? There is another layer to this quiet, the absence of writing. The Mongol Empire was oral in nature. Its history lived in songs, in stories, in the mouths of elders around fires. Very little was written down, and what was often came later, through foreign eyes. The most famous account of Genghis Khan's life, The Secret History of the Mongols, was likely written after his death. It speaks of his childhood, his rise, his wars, but not his burial, not directly. Even here, in this carefully preserved text, the final chapter is silence. We are left instead with suggestions, whispers, the feeling of a door barely ajar, never opened. In the absence of certainty, speculation blooms. Was he buried alone? Was he entombed with treasure? Did his loyal guards carry his body by night, guided only by stars? We do not know. But in not knowing, we feel something deeper. Not frustration, but respect. This is not a puzzle to solve. It is a boundary to honor. And still, the mystery lingers. In 2004, a team of Japanese and Mongolian archaeologists claimed to have found traces of a burial site in the Khenti region. But the results were inconclusive. And again, permission to excavate was denied. More recently, satellite scans and AI models have tried to trace ancient roads, river bends, soil patterns. Some say the burial site lies beneath a forbidden mountain. Others say it is already lost, that erosion, time, and secrecy have buried it beyond memory. And yet, the land remains untouched. Still, waiting. It is possible, even likely, that the people who knew the exact location are long gone, that the secret died with them. But it is also possible that someone still knows. That, in a quiet home, deep in the steppe, an elder still tells the story, not to strangers, not to cameras, but to their child, as the fire crackles. A lullaby, not a lecture, history in its softest form. And so we return to the wind, still moving, still singing, still brushing over hills that may or may not hold a secret. It does not shout. It does not explain. It only moves. And we, curious, respectful, dreaming, follow. Not to find a grave, but to understand why it matters that we don't. They say empires leave behind echoes, and yet the Mongol Empire seems to have left behind mostly wind. A breath across the grasses, a shiver through the birch trees, the cry of a hawk far above where the sky feels too deep to belong to men. It is difficult to imagine even now that this silence was once the heart of the world's largest land empire. But silence can be misleading. Beneath the quiet lies an intensity that no stone can contain, a story too large for ruins or relics. Genghis Khan did not leave behind pyramids or marble columns or gilded cathedrals. His legacy was motion, expansion like a wave, sweeping outward from the steppe until it touched the edges of Europe, the sands of Arabia, the forests of China. And when the wave receded, it left no clear tomb, no fixed monument, only questions, only absence. The mystery of his burial is not an accident of time, nor a product of poor record-keeping. It was intentional, sacred even. His burial was an act of ritual, not remembrance, a moment designed not to last in stone but to fade into soil. And yet that fading did not diminish his presence. For centuries after his death, Genghis Khan's name was still whispered with awe and dread. His descendants still ruled enormous swaths of the known world, and his influence shaped entire cultures. He was everywhere, except in death. That final location, the one thing that might anchor him, was taken from us, or never given at all. And this paradox, a man so powerful, yet so absent, has drawn us closer to the mystery rather than pushed us away. It is as if the absence itself is what gives his story its weight. Imagine for a moment the men who rode with him in his final days. These were not ordinary soldiers, but his most trusted companions, men who had crossed continents with him, who had burned cities and spared none, yet who had also knelt beside dying comrades and watched the sky for omens. These were the men, entrusted with his body after his final breath. And what a heavy burden that must have been. Not just the physical weight of the Khan's remains, but the spiritual weight of protecting him from time. Their task was not to preserve him for display, but to erase his final trail, to return him to the earth in such a way that no footsteps could be followed, no cairn stumbled upon, no blade of grass out of place. Some say these men buried him under the cover of darkness, guided by stars and silence. Others believe they built a false trail, a decoy procession to mislead enemies and treasure hunters. And there are those who believe they wept as they dug, aware that they were not merely burying a body, but burying a bond, a living chapter of their people's soul. Once the grave was filled, They scattered the earth until even their own shadows could not find it. And then, perhaps, they rode away in all directions, never to speak of it again. Maybe they swore an oath. Maybe they carried that silence until the end of their own lives, taking the secret with them into the dark. Centuries passed. The Mongol Empire fractured into smaller khanates. Some were absorbed into China, others into Persia or Russia. The old roads faded, and new languages replaced the old oaths. But the legend of Genghis Khan did not fade. It slipped into stories, told by firelight, into the lullabies of herders, into the pride of distant descendants. And always, there was the question, where is he? Not just his body, but the center of his being. The grave became less a place and more an idea, a symbol of how power and humility can exist in the same breath. Because even in death, Genghis Khan honored the Mongol way. No palaces, no marble, just the embrace of the land. There have been theories, of course. So many theories. Some say his tomb lies beneath the sacred Burkhan Khaldun mountain in northeastern Mongolia, a place where he once prayed for survival during his youth. Others suggest an unmarked valley near the Onan River, where his family's ancestral lands stretched. Still others point to sites farther afield. Buried chambers in the Gobi Desert, forested hillsides planted to mask a secret, even artificial rivers diverted to cover the grave forever. Yet no matter how deep we dig, literally or metaphorically, nothing certain has been found. The earth yields artifacts, yes, arrowheads, pottery shards, ancient bones. But none say, here lies Genghis Khan. None close the question. The silence holds. It is not for lack of trying. Over the past century, archaeologists from Russia, Japan, China, and the West have tried to locate the tomb using everything from historical texts to satellite imaging. In one project, artificial intelligence was used to scan satellite photographs of the Khenti region for patterns of human activity, ancient paths, unusual clearings, deviations in vegetation that might hint at construction. One such area was found, a suspiciously remote and symmetrical mound. Excavation was proposed, but the Mongolian government denied access, citing the need to respect cultural heritage and traditional beliefs. And perhaps in that refusal lies the most honest answer we've had yet, that some things are not meant to be unearthed. It is easy, from a Western perspective, to view the refusal to search as a denial of truth. But the Mongolian view is different. To them, truth is not always about exposure. Sometimes it is about harmony. To leave a grave untouched is not to forget a man, but to honor him. Disturbing that grave would not bring closure. It would bring imbalance. And perhaps that is what makes the mystery so powerful. We live in a time that worships answers, but here is a question that cannot be solved by force, only approached with reverence. It reminds us that not everything is ours to uncover. Some stories must be felt, not found, and so we are left with the story, not the site, with the legend, not the landmark. And perhaps that is enough, perhaps more than enough. For when we lie awake at night, wondering about what lies beneath that distant soil, we are connecting with something greater than archaeology. We are engaging in an ancient form of listening to the wind, to the silence, to the old rhythms of reverence and restraint. In a world that too often shouts, Genghis Khan's grave teaches us to whisper. There is a certain beauty in the unknowable, a grace in the fact that even the greatest conqueror in history could vanish into the grass. It reminds us that death, no matter how grand or humble, returns us all to the same earth, that kings and herders alike become part of the soil, part of the rain, part of the wind that moves endlessly across the land. And so maybe it's not that no one knows where Genghis Khan is buried. Maybe it's that everyone does, because he is buried everywhere, in the breath of the wind, in the fold of the hills, in the stories told by children who have never seen a map, but know how to find the stars. Still, the question lingers, not for answers, but for wonder. Where does memory go when it is protected, not preserved? When it is wrapped in silence rather than stone? The Mongols gave us one of history's greatest empires, and they took from us one of its greatest secrets. And in that exchange, they taught us something no empire of marble ever could, that the most powerful legacies are the ones that do not end at the grave. There is something humbling about a man who ruled over more land than any other in history, and yet, when he died, asked for no monument, no gilded tomb, no pyramid visible from the heavens. The final resting place of Genghis Khan was never meant to be visited, or marked, or even known. It was meant to disappear. In a world where so much of power is measured by permanence, by stone and steel and record, his absence is louder than any inscription. We build statues to remember, but here was a man who asked to be forgotten, not in the sense of erasure, but in the sense of release. A return to nature, to spirit, to the eternal blue sky that the Mongols revered so deeply. And perhaps the deepest mystery of all is not how he vanished, but how that choice continues to resist the modern world's hunger for discovery. Every decade, new tools emerge. Ground-penetrating radar, drone mapping, infrared thermal imaging. We can scan entire mountains now, see below the surface, detect ruins buried under centuries of soil. And yet, every time we look for him, the earth remains silent. No whispers, no clues. It's as if the land itself has become an accomplice in the act of concealment. The burial itself, if we believe the stories, was not merely about hiding a body. It was a ceremony wrapped in secrecy and devotion, orchestrated by a people who saw death as a passage rather than an end. The men who carried out the burial, handpicked, fiercely loyal, were not simply grave diggers. They were guardians of a legacy, bound by duty and silence. Some accounts say they buried the great Khan in the sacred forest of the Khenti Mountains, where he had once sought refuge in his youth, kneeling beneath trees that still whisper through the canopy. Others suggest a more elaborate ritual, that they dug a deep shaft in the earth, perhaps even lined it with treasures, and then trampled the ground with hundreds of horses until no trace of the grave remained. And yet, no matter the version, all stories converge on a shared truth, that what happened in those final hours was not meant for history books or headlines. It was meant for the soil, for the sky, for the spirits who roam the plains unseen. We often forget that the Mongol worldview was not centered on visibility, but on flow, on movement, on the seamless blending of man with nature, of life with legend. Their gods did not live in temples, but in wind and fire and thunder. To them, the sacred did not need to be framed. It needed to be respected, quietly, from a distance. This reverence extended even to death. Unlike the pharaohs of Egypt or the emperors of China, who prepared their tombs as monuments to their own greatness, Genghis Khan's people believed that greatness was not shown by what was left behind, but by how well one could vanish into the eternal rhythm of the world. And vanish he did, as if becoming one with the land he had once ruled, so thoroughly that even now, almost 800 years later, no one has found him. Not scholars, not scientists, not treasure hunters. He has become myth and memory, and perhaps that was always the point. There were attempts, of course. In the Soviet era, expeditions were planned in secret. The idea of finding Genghis Khan's tomb was irresistible, a prize that promised both historical prestige and symbolic conquest. But the terrain was harsh, the permits elusive, and the maps inconsistent. Some expeditions turned back before they even reached the search zones. Others dug in the wrong places entirely. In recent years, international efforts have ramped up again. Universities have teamed with tech firms. Grants have been issued. Massive digital mapping projects launched. One group scanned nearly 7,000 square kilometers of Mongolia from space, searching for patterns in the landscape that could suggest buried architecture, a ceremonial complex, a grave chamber, anything. But each time they thought they might be close, the answer dissolved like morning fog. Even more telling, many modern Mongolian people oppose these searches outright, not because they lack interest in their own history, but because they believe in protecting what their ancestors chose to keep hidden. To dig into the earth where the great Khan may rest is not viewed as discovery, but disturbance. A breach of ancient trust, a disruption of sacred balance. And perhaps that is where the heart of this story lies. Not in the absence of evidence, but in the presence of restraint. In a world driven by curiosity, by ambition, by the need to unearth and explain and conquer with knowledge, the story of Genghis Khan's burial reminds us of the dignity in leaving something untouched. There are few things modern civilization has not tried to expose, but here is one. A patch of land somewhere in Mongolia, or perhaps no patch at all, just wind, holding one of the greatest untold truths of human history. And the silence around it is more eloquent than any inscription. Every generation has its seekers, its wanderers who believe that with just the right technology, the right document, the right clue, they can solve the mystery, but the land does not yield. And it may never. There are rumors of a hidden monastery that holds the answer. A scroll passed down through generations, written in code. There are whispers of a bloodline, a family entrusted with the secret, bound by vows older than kingdoms. Some even believe that the grave lies beneath a lake, its location protected by deliberate diversion of the water, a trick to place his body in a chamber that can never be reached without draining the soul of the land itself. But even if such things are true, they are likely lost now. Lost not in the sense of being forgotten, but in the sense of being accepted as unknowable. The earth holds many things, and not all are meant to be retrieved. Sometimes, what is buried is not just bone, but belief. And yet, still we wonder. That's the beautiful contradiction at the core of this mystery. Even those who say it should remain untouched still feel the pulse of curiosity. The late night, thought, the quiet moment of dreaming. What would it be like to stand at the edge of that hidden grave? Not to open it, not to disturb it, just to be near it, to feel that space in the world where a legend truly rests. Would the air feel different? Would the wind slow? Would the silence deepen? Or would it be like standing anywhere else? Plain, grass, the same sky, the same cold breath of the morning. And if so, would that not be fitting? That the man who rode at the head of 1,000 armies could rest beneath the same clouds as a shepherd or a herder. No statue, no script, just eternity. This may be the most profound gift he left us, not his empire, which fell in time, or his conquests, which blurred into borders, but this final gesture of vanishing, a whisper instead of a monument, a secret kept by a people who understood that reverence is not about what you reveal, but what you protect. We are so used to graves that declare, that boast, here lies so-and-so, hero of such and such, with this date and that honor. But Genghis Khan's grave may say nothing, maybe nothing but earth. And still, it says more. It tells us about humility, about tradition, about the idea that sometimes the greatest legacy is not in what you build, but in what you choose to leave unbuilt. As we drift into sleep with this thought, imagine the steppe at dusk. No cities, no wires, just the endless grass, the brush of hooves, the long, soft light that turns everything gold. Somewhere out there, or nowhere at all, is a place where silence has held for 800 years. It has endured storms, invasions, revolutions, satellite scans, and still it endures. The grave may be mythical, the man historical. But the quiet is real. And in that quiet, we find something rare. Not a tomb, not a ruin, but a kind of peace. There is a strange stillness that comes when you speak the name Genghis Khan and let it settle into the air, not with fear or awe, but with a kind of quiet respect. You feel it differently than other names from history. His is not cold and carved into marble. It lingers like smoke from a long extinguished fire, not easily grasped yet impossible to ignore. As the centuries pass, most great figures either fade into irrelevance or harden into caricature, reduced to dates and victories and footnotes in textbooks. But Genghis Khan, somehow, remains alive in silence. Not in the loud proclamations of empire or the grandeur of preserved tombs, but in the absence of those very things. He has become more than anything, a presence that resists being seen, as if the earth itself agreed to keep one final secret, wrapped in root and river and time. And it is in this silence that something ancient stirs, not an answer, but a question that grows deeper the more you sit with it. What does it mean to vanish on purpose? To leave no place where the world can point and say, "Here he lies," and yet to never be forgotten. The world has always searched for him, or at least for what he left behind. Not just his tomb, but the traces of his passage, the shadow he cast across so many lands. We've traced the roots of his armies, studied the languages his empire, touched, uncovered entire cities that once bowed to his name, and yet, the center of it all, the quiet end, remains untouched. It's as though history itself agreed to keep its distance, allowing everything around him to be examined, except for the final moment. And there's something deeply human in that. Because deep down, we too crave a little mystery. In a world where nearly everything is mapped, scanned, archived, and explained, the idea that something, anything, remains beyond reach gives us a strange comfort, especially when that something is not a monster or a miracle, but a man. A man who died and asked that the land itself swallow the truth of him. We like to think we want answers, but sometimes the question is, what gives life its weight? In recent decades, there have been renewed attempts to uncover the truth. Researchers have combed through the old texts, not just Mongolian sources, but Persian, Chinese, Russian, European, looking for discrepancies, clues, details that might narrow the search. Historians pore over obscure passages in The Secret, History of the Mongols, hoping that a poetic phrase about a mountain or a bend in the river might point to the right place. Geographers cross-reference ancient trade routes with modern terrain data. Tech companies build AI models to analyze terrain shifts, erosion patterns, vegetation anomalies. Teams of volunteers scour satellite imagery by hand, pixel by pixel, hoping to spot something unnatural in the landscape. And still, nothing. Not nothing in the disappointing sense, but nothing in the quiet, sacred sense. Like waiting by a locked door and realizing no key was ever made. The silence is not empty. It is deliberate, and in that, there is more meaning than most discoveries ever carry. Even the local people, especially the local people, approach this story with care. In many parts of Mongolia, it is still considered disrespectful to search for the tomb. Not out of superstition alone, but out of cultural memory. To dig where the great Khan rests is not curiosity, it is intrusion. Mongolian shamans and elders speak of sacred places that should not be disturbed, where the energy is too strong, too bound to the past. They believe that some things are meant to be left as they are, and that to violate that balance is to invite misfortune. This isn't merely folklore. It's a worldview, one where the past is not a collection of artifacts, but a living presence, a presence that watches, remembers, and waits. And so when foreign expeditions arrive with drones and excavation permits, they are often met with polite refusals, or more often, with silence. Because some doors are closed not because they can't be opened, but because the act of opening them changes something fundamental. And what would happen if we did find it? Let's pause and imagine quietly, without rushing to conclusions. Let's say the grave is found, through chance or technology or sheer persistence. What would it contain? Bones, perhaps. A few items of value. Maybe even inscriptions, if the myths are wrong. And yes, it would be a global event. Museums would compete for exhibitions. Documentaries would be made. The tourism would be enormous. The image of his grave, once secret for centuries, would be shared millions of times, reduced to pixels and hashtags. But then what? Would we understand him any better? Would we grasp more fully what he built, or what he took, or what he dreamed as he grew old? Or would the mystery simply be replaced with something smaller, something finite, measurable, catalogued? Would we gain knowledge or lose wonder? It is worth asking. Because not all discoveries are gains. Sometimes, in the act of solving a mystery, we kill it. We strip it of its weight and turn it into something to consume rather than something to contemplate. And yet, the mystery endures, in large part because it was designed to. If the stories are true, the burial was an elaborate ritual, not just of concealment, but of erasure. 1,000 riders, it is said, trampled the earth to hide any sign of the grave. Some tales go further, that rivers were redirected to flow over the tomb, or forests planted atop it. That every person who helped bury the Khan was executed, and those who executed them were killed in turn, until only the secret remained. It sounds cruel, and perhaps it was, but cruelty was not the goal. Containment was. The burial was not an end, but a return. In the Mongol worldview, the land is not separate from the self. To be buried in secret is to become part of the land again, not a landmark, but a presence. And in this way, Genghis Khan did not die, so much as dissolve, becoming not a point on a map, but a breath in the wind, a shadow on the plain, a silence that rides beside every storm. There is also the question of whether the grave even still exists in any form. 800 years is a long time. Earth shifts, trees fall, rivers meander, climate changes. And if, as some believe, the grave was unmarked, then even the most carefully concealed burial might have collapsed inward, been buried deeper, or even eroded into nothing. There may be no chamber left, no artifacts, no trace of design. Just soil and root and stone. And if that is the case, then the mystery is no longer about location. It is about meaning, about what it says of a man to vanish so completely that even his bones cannot hold shape. And yet, he is not forgotten. His name is spoken, his deeds remembered. The world he changed continues to ripple outward. What does it say about us then, that we still feel this absence as something we must explain? Why do we chase what he gave freely to the earth? Perhaps it is because we are not used to legacies without places. We visit ruins and tombs and statues to feel connection. We need a where to make sense of a who. And yet, in this one story, we are denied that final piece. And maybe that's exactly what keeps the story alive. A statue can be defaced, a tomb can be looted, but a secret held by the land that lives forever. And maybe that's what Genghis Khan understood better than most. Not how to conquer cities, but how to step out of history's grasp, to become a myth without ever becoming a monument. And in doing so, he gave us something rare, a mystery that teaches not just about him, but about us. So if you ever find yourself walking alone through the Mongolian steppe, far from any village, with only the wind and the grass for company, stop for a moment. Listen, not with your ears, but with the part of you that still believes in stories. Feel the weight of that silence, not as emptiness, but as presence, as a kind of memory that lives not in books, but in the ground. Maybe he is there, maybe not, But does it matter? His grave was never the point. The silence is the grave. And that silence still speaks. There is something deeply human in the way we long to know where a story ends, in the way our minds loop back to the unfinished, to the unspoken, to the pieces that were never laid down in stone. And perhaps this is why, after centuries of change, conflict, and discovery, the question of Genghis Khan's final resting place still lingers not in textbooks or conference halls, but in the quiet thoughts of people who, long after midnight, find themselves staring out a window or lying beneath a blank ceiling, wondering about a patch of earth that no one can name, not because of what might be found beneath it, but because of what it might mean to never find it at all. We speak so often of legacy in terms of what survives: documents, structures, titles, bones. But perhaps the greatest legacy is not what we leave behind, but what we take with us. Genghis Khan took something with him into the earth, something so complete, so well guarded, so folded into the fabric of the land, that no one has been able to reclaim it. And it is not merely the loss of a tomb that captures our imagination. It is the decision behind that loss, the ritual, the quiet finality, the way an entire people conspired not to reveal, but to conceal. Not because they feared what would happen if he were found, but because they understood that some things grow stronger in the dark. When you walk across the Mongolian steppe, and you must imagine it now, as your thoughts slow and your breath softens, you feel a kind of vastness that humbles every question. The sky is so wide it erases ambition. The land rolls on without border or blemish. Just undulating grass and distant hills, like a sea that forgot how to wave. Somewhere out there, they say, is the place. But the more you look, the less certain you become that there is any place at all. Maybe the grave is not a place, but a condition, a way of remembering without anchoring. For centuries, those who sought to find it tried to tie his memory to coordinates, to topography, to landmarks. They pored over ancient texts, followed vague directions, measured distances passed down in riddles. Some mapped the rivers near Burkhan Khaldun, others examined the shifting lines of ancient paths, and a few even tried to interview elders who had once known someone, who had once heard from someone else where the sacred burial site might lie. But every road eventually bent back into myth, every clue blurred into interpretation. And in that slow undoing, the mystery deepened. Not because it became harder to solve, but because the solving itself became less important than the presence of the mystery, and what a presence it is. Genghis Khan's legacy is not one of artifacts and mausoleums. It is written in languages changed by his empire, in borders shaped by his conquests, in the memory of movement, of horses crossing mountains, of couriers carrying messages across continents. His presence lives in the echoes of battlefields and in the laws he left behind. But even more than that, it lives in the hush that surrounds his absence. He is one of the few figures in history whose missing grave has become more significant than any that might have been found. Because this absence, this careful, sacred emptiness, invites a kind of reverence we no longer practice. It asks us to sit with not knowing, to listen rather than excavate, to observe the sky as it turns gold at dusk, and accept that some stories do not end with answers, but with the quiet continuation of wonder. And perhaps this is why every generation continues to ask the question, even knowing they will not receive an answer. The act of asking becomes a ritual in itself, a way to participate in a very old silence. When archaeologists propose new expeditions, when journalists write new articles, when filmmakers try to trace the footsteps of a vanished king, they are doing more than searching. They are offering respect, because the search has never really been about finding. It has always been about honoring a man who asked to be left alone, and a people who agreed. The fact that so many have tried and failed, and that none have defied the deepest sacred boundaries to do so, may be the clearest sign that his burial is still protected, not by guards, but by memory, by culture, by belief. There is still a part of the world where mystery is stronger than ambition. And as you lie still, letting this idea take root in your thoughts, imagine the moment of his burial. Not the details, those are lost, but the feeling. A cold morning, perhaps. Low clouds. Men dressed in furs, silent, focused. A stretch of land chosen not for grandeur, but for its ability to disappear. Perhaps they walked in a circle around the grave before covering it, whispering words no one has spoken since. Perhaps they sang, or perhaps they simply stood there, knowing that what they were doing was not just for a man, but for the spirit of a people who believed that greatness should end not with noise, but with stillness. Then the ground was closed, trampled, smoothed, the riders dispersed. And that was it. No marker, no trace, just memory, folding itself into the earth like mist. Even now, the land where he is believed to rest remains largely undeveloped, shielded by tradition, by law, and by a general sense of collective protection. There are no monuments atop the mountains, no roads leading into the forests where the oldest rumors point. And this, too, feels deliberate. Mongolia is one of the few places on Earth where land still holds power over people, where geography is not simply resource or obstacle, but spirit, where the sky is not scenery, but presence. And so, the possibility that his grave is hidden in plain sight, not beneath layers of stone but beneath layers of respect, becomes more believable. Not because of what we know, but because of what we've learned to leave alone. And isn't that in the end a kind of peace? That in all our centuries of movement, of cataloging, of turning the world into data, there is still one place, unconfirmed, uncertain, unclaimed, that holds its own against every satellite, every expedition, every theory. It is not a loss. It is not a failure of knowledge. It is a decision made long ago that some stories do not belong in museums, that some endings do not belong in books, that some men, no matter how vast their empires, choose to vanish not because they are forgotten, but because they wish to be remembered differently. And so, the wind still moves across the steppe. The grasses bend without knowing what lies beneath. The rivers continue their slow journeys, curving past hills that no longer carry names. And somewhere in all of this, there may be, or may not be, a grave. But that does not change the weight of the silence. It does not change the fact that we still wonder, that we still whisper, that we still listen. Because sometimes, the greatest mark of a life is the quiet it leaves behind. There is a moment, often just before sleep, when the mind floats between what is real and what is imagined. And in that space, weightless, silent, drifting, the question returns like a soft echo in an empty valley. Where is he? Not out of urgency, not even out of need, but out of something quieter, a kind of reaching, a desire to touch the untouchable, to stand beside the most enduring absence the ancient world ever left behind. For it is not merely a grave we speak of, not merely the bones of a conqueror, but a story so carefully buried that time itself has tiptoed around it. And in this story, the land becomes not just a setting, but a character, a guardian, a confidant, a silent witness to something that was never meant to be disturbed. Genghis Khan, who reshaped continents and cultures, did not ask to be remembered in stone, but to be remembered in silence. And that request has held longer than any palace, longer than any kingdom, longer than even the fear his name once carried. And so, the hills of Mongolia remain vast and patient. The wind blows without pause, and the stars overhead shine on the steppe just as they did 800 years ago, unbothered by history, unconcerned with monuments. It is a land where the past does not rest beneath glass or behind ropes, but beneath hooves and snow and breath, in a place that asks not to be found, but simply felt. We live in a time where everything is mapped, measured, named. The world has become a network of points and pixels, and we are rarely far from the answer to any question we think to ask. But there are still questions the internet cannot solve, still silences no algorithm can break, still places whose very meaning depends on their remaining uncertain. And that is why the mystery of Genghis Khan's burial continues to live, not in books or databases, but in the deep, slow rhythm of the earth itself, in the folds of a landscape that has never betrayed its secret. It is said that before his death, he made one final request: that no marker be raised, no road be built, no trace remain. And those who loved him, or feared him, kept that promise so thoroughly, so perfectly, that even now, with all our tools and all our ambition, we cannot undo what they buried. And perhaps that is the greatest act of loyalty the world has ever known. A loyalty that speaks not in oaths or chronicles, but in generations of silence. Silence not born of ignorance, but of respect. A silence passed from parent to child like an heirloom, unspoken, intact. It is tempting to imagine that somewhere, someone still knows. That the knowledge did not die, but was folded quietly into an oral tradition, kept alive only among a handful of families, only whispered under certain moons, only mentioned when the wind shifts in a particular way. That in a corner of a quiet yurt, by the flickering light of an oil lamp, an elder once leaned toward a grandchild and said, "This hill, this tree, this place." And maybe that child, grown now and aged in turn, carries the memory like a stone tucked into the lining of their coat, not to be used, not to be shown, but to be kept. Or maybe the secret truly was lost. Maybe the last to know it fell in battle or slipped from a horse or died without a listener. And if that's true, then Genghis Khan's resting place has become something rarer still. A moment known once and never again. A secret so pure it passed into the land without residue. And yet, even in the not knowing, we still find presence. The mystery itself becomes a kind of knowledge, the way a sealed letter still speaks by being unread, the way a locked door shapes the room even without a key. Modern archaeologists have come close, they say. Some believe the grave lies beneath the Khenti Mountains, in a region long considered sacred and deliberately undeveloped. A few satellite scans show unusual mounds, strange shadows, patterns that seem unnatural. But no excavation is permitted, and those who request it are often met with soft refusal. The locals do not argue. They simply do not assist. And there is power in that refusal, the kind that no technology can overcome. Because in this mystery, the boundary is not physical, but cultural. Not a fence, but a feeling. It is the understanding that the land has already given enough, and that to ask for more is to ignore the gift of what was already shared. The story, the memory, the echo. And so we circle the mystery like pilgrims who dare not enter the shrine, not out of fear, but out of awe. We study the edges, we name the hills, we guess. And still, the center holds. If Genghis Khan had chosen to be entombed like a pharaoh, surrounded by treasure and guarded by stone, we would know the site today. It would be a monument, a tourist attraction, a textbook photo. But he chose instead to disappear, to be absorbed by the land, to become part of the thing he had once roamed so freely. And in doing so, he gave us something we rarely receive in the study of history: humility. We do not control this story. We do not define its borders. We do not even know where it ends. All we can do is listen to the myths, to the silence, to the wind as it carries ancient dust across the grass. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps more than enough. Because what this mystery teaches us is not how to find something, but how to live with its absence. How to sit beside a question without answering it. How to honor a man not by knowing where he lies, but by understanding why we never will. And maybe, in the end, the grave was never meant to be a place at all. Maybe it was meant to be a lesson, a way of reminding us that not all greatness needs to be seen, not all power needs to be proven, and not all stories need to be complete. That sometimes the most sacred thing is the choice not to be known. And so the steppe rolls on, the rivers wander, the stars continue their quiet spinning, and the name of Genghis Khan drifts through it all like a low hum in the bones of the world. Not found, not forgotten, simply present, in the places we cannot map. Sometimes, when the wind is just right and the moon hangs low over the wide, open steppe, it feels as if the land itself remembers. It doesn't speak in words, and it never answers directly. But there is something in the air. A hush, a pause, an ancient kind of patience that suggests the memory of something important still lingers, like the warmth of a campfire long after the flames have gone. Maybe it's the way the grass leans under the weight of that wind, or how the hills roll with a kind of careful slowness, like the folds of a heavy robe laid out by time. Maybe it's the silence, not empty, but full of something we can't name. Here in this vastness, the story of Genghis Khan doesn't feel like a tale from the past, but a presence that walks just out of sight, as if the man himself has never fully left, only stepped back into the rhythm of the land that raised him. And that rhythm, that deep, measured pulse of earth and sky and wind, is where the question continues to live. Not loudly, not urgently, but with the quiet persistence of something unresolved, something too sacred to be spoken plainly. Where is he? The man who once rode across continents and who now, perhaps, lies beneath the same ground his horse once crossed, so perfectly hidden that even the centuries can't seem to touch him. It's a strange thing, this desire to know where someone is buried, especially someone we've never met, whose face we've never seen, whose voice we'll never hear. And yet we seek it, not out of morbid curiosity, but because there is something about a grave that gives shape to a life. It gives us a place to go, a place to imagine the end, to tie the loose ends of a story together with stone and soil. But what happens when there is no place? What happens when the ending is scattered into the air, when the final page is missing, and the only thing left is the space where certainty used to live? That, perhaps, is the heart of this mystery. Not that Genghis Khan's body is gone, but that it was never meant to be found. That those who loved him most saw in his death not a reason to mark a spot, but a reason to protect it. And that choice, deliberate, collective, and profound, has become his final empire, an invisible kingdom held together not by borders or blood, but by silence. A silence so carefully kept, so faithfully guarded, that it has outlasted dynasties, ideologies, even the technologies designed to pierce through time. And maybe that is why we still think of him, still speak his name in the dark hours of the night, still stare out across unbroken plains and wonder, not because we want to solve something, but because we're drawn to the rare moments in human history when forgetting becomes an act of love. Think of the people who must have carried him, not just his body, but the weight of the moment. His generals, his sons, his most trusted guards. They would have moved quietly, slowly, aware that every step was heavy with meaning. Perhaps they wore black, or wrapped their heads in wool. Perhaps they rode at night, beneath a sky so full of stars, that the shadows seemed to vanish altogether. They would have chosen a path not marked by banners or roads, but by instinct, by memory, by a sense of what the land could hide. And when they arrived, wherever they arrived, they would have made no speeches. There would have been no burning pyres, no ceremonial trumpets. Only the sounds of digging, the clink of tools in cold earth, the steady breath of horses waiting nearby. Maybe someone recited a prayer. Maybe not. Maybe the greatest honor was in the doing, not the saying. And when it was finished, when the ground was covered again, when the place looked just as it had before, They would have left in silence, scattering to the wind, their task completed, their secret sealed, and the secret has held. Through conquest and collapse, through the rise of nations and the fall of others, through revolutions, colonizations, occupations, exoduses, the grave has never been found. Not by kings, not by scholars, not by thieves. It has been searched, for by those with gold in their eyes and those with reverence in their hearts, and still it remains, if it remains at all, untouched. Some say it lies beneath a sacred mountain, others that it was covered by a river. Some believe the ground was flattened by 1,000 horses, that a forest was planted atop it, that the trees themselves remember. There are maps drawn in whispers, stories carved into the edges of language, hints that lead nowhere. But all that remains is a circle of not knowing, a ring around a truth that may never be reached. And perhaps that is the most fitting ending. For if Genghis Khan taught the world anything, it is that the truest kind of power does not always raise its voice. Sometimes it withdraws. Sometimes it vanishes. And in that vanishing, it becomes unbreakable. Now imagine lying there, deep beneath the soil, surrounded not by walls or treasure, but by roots and stones and the slow, constant breath of the earth. The air is still. The weight of the world presses gently down. There is no marker, no nameplate, no crown, only the dirt and the silence and the long memory of the sky above. And maybe that's all he wanted, to return to where he came from, not to be glorified, but to be at peace, to let the land hold him, as it always had, to be part of something larger than empire, something that could not be conquered. And maybe we, who try so hard to hold on to everything, can learn something from that surrender, that the greatest stories are not always those shouted from rooftops, but those whispered in winds, that sometimes the final act of greatness is to disappear. And so, the steppe endures. The grasses still bend. The rivers still move. The stars still wheel overhead in their cold, silent procession. And somewhere, or nowhere, a secret continues to sleep, untouched, unknown, undefeated. We do not need to find it to know that it matters. Its presence is in the not finding. Its truth is in the question. And as long as that question lingers, so too does the story of the man who once ruled the world and then asked the world to let him go. There is something sacred in what remains unfound, something strangely beautiful in the way a mystery resists explanation, not out of stubbornness but out of reverence, as if the silence itself is a form of memory, a way of holding something precious without needing to possess it. And the story of Genghis Khan's burial has, over the centuries, transformed into one of the purest forms of such mystery, a narrative defined not by what we know, but by what we do not, and by what we choose, again and again, not to disturb. For in the end, it is not the grave that matters, not the soil or the stones or the treasure that may or may not lie beneath it, but the weight of everything that grave represents, the loyalty of those who kept the secret, the humility of a man who chose to disappear, and the quiet agreement, passed down through generations, that some things are made more powerful by being left alone. As we drift deeper into this story, we begin to feel that the absence itself has shape, that it is not emptiness, but presence, invisible, quiet, endlessly patient, like the still air in a sacred chamber, or the silence after a great song, has ended when no one speaks, because they are still listening with something deeper than ears. In this way, the story of the lost grave becomes a meditation, not on death, but on what it means to let go, to return, not in fanfare or gold, but in silence and wind and the slow turning of the earth. And if we sit with that silence long enough, we begin to feel the contours of a different kind of monument, one not built of stone or wood, but of memory, respect, and space left intentionally unfilled. Think of all the things we've built over graves: cathedrals, towers, cities, museums. Think of all the names etched into marble, the bodies boxed in tombs, the voices preserved in books and stone. And then think of the steppe, unbroken, wide, unchanged. Think of the sky above it, vast and ancient. The same sky he must have watched, as a boy, as a general, as a ruler, and perhaps again as he was carried one final time across the grass. No signs, no path, no shrine. Just land and light and time. In a world that constantly demands certainty, there is a strange power in this unmarked resting place. It teaches us that not all greatness requires recognition, that not every legacy must be built on visibility, and that sometimes the truest form of remembrance is restraint. And so, even as we wonder where he lies, we find ourselves stepping more carefully, speaking more softly, not because we are lost, but because we are approaching something sacred. Not a grave, but a lesson. There are those who still search, of course. Expeditions are planned, funded, equipped with the latest tools. Remote sensing, satellite imaging, AI models, all aimed at one purpose: to pierce the veil of time and silence and locate the grave. Some say it's a matter of probability now, of statistics and patience, that if we scan every inch of land, test every possible hypothesis, the answer must eventually emerge. But what if the grave is not a matter of discovery, but of permission? What if it cannot be found because it is not meant to be? Or worse, what if, in finding it, we lose the very thing that made it meaningful? Because a mystery solved is no longer a mystery. It becomes a place on a map, a line in a report, a photograph to be shared. It becomes something you can touch. And in touching it, something is always taken. The magic, the dignity, the stillness, all replaced by measurements and headlines. And perhaps the people of Mongolia, who for centuries have protected this silence, understand this better than anyone, that the value of the grave is not in its contents, but in its concealment. And so the land remains unchanged. The hills roll on. The rivers glint beneath the sun. The grass whispers in the wind. Somewhere, in this expanse, or nowhere at all, the Khan rests, not as a king entombed in gold, but as a man returned to the earth. And this, too, changes how we think of power. For Genghis Khan once held more of it than any man alive. His armies thundered across continents. His name could end wars, bend empires, reshape civilizations. And yet, at the end, he chose silence. Chose to be buried not in a palace, but in plain land, beneath no monument, with no witness save the sky. That choice speaks louder than any conquest. It reminds us that true power is not in being seen, but in being remembered rightly, not as a statue or a myth, but as a presence that continues to shape the world quietly, gently, persistently. And maybe that's why we still return to this question. Not because we expect to answer it, but because the asking brings us closer to something rare. In seeking his grave, we become more aware of our own need to explain, to label, to know. And in the refusal of the land to yield its secret, we are reminded that the world still holds some things beyond our grasp. That despite all our knowledge, all our reach, there are still stories that live just outside the circle of light. And in that darkness, there is peace. A peace that does not demand closure. A peace that does not crumble under time. A peace that breathes like the wind and rests like the mountains and remembers like the soil. And so we let the question remain. We let it live. Because in that question is a kind of reverence, not just for Genghis Khan, but for all things we cannot possess. For mystery, for memory, for the silence that still speaks after everything else has gone quiet. There is a strange comfort in knowing that some things lie beyond the reach of certainty, that even in an age of data and discovery and endless visibility, there still exists a silence so old and so complete that it has held firm for over 800 years, untouched by time, unmoved by curiosity, unmapped and unclaimed. That silence, wrapped gently around the final resting place of Genghis Khan, is not accidental. It was made, crafted with care, stitched into the land by the hands of men who knew that greatness could not always be measured by what is found, but sometimes by what is hidden. And so, long after the cities he conquered have crumbled, long after the languages he touched have evolved, long after the borders of his empire have been redrawn again and again, what remains is not his tomb, but the deliberate absence of it. The unanswered question, the unbroken secret, the idea that somewhere, beneath a hill or beside a river, or deep within the forested folds of the steppe, he rests without monument, without stone, without name. And that, in its quiet way, is more powerful than any mausoleum, because it means that he did not need to be remembered by marble or map. He is remembered in the question itself, in the fact that we are still asking, still wondering, still listening to the wind for answers it refuses to give. Imagine the hands that dug that grave, whoever they were, rough with cold and callous, maybe shaking from grief or exhaustion or reverence. Imagine the breath of the horses in the cold morning air, the quiet of the soldiers standing nearby, not speaking, not looking directly at one another, each aware that they were part of something enormous, something final. No ceremony, no audience, just the land, the body, and the promise. A promise not to tell, not to mark, not to build, just to let it be. And then perhaps 100 horses trampling the ground above it until no trace remained, until even they could no longer say where they had stood. That kind of silence, the one you build with loyalty, not stone, is rare. And it endures because it was meant to, because it was sacred, and because the people who kept it did not treat it like a mystery to be solved, but like a truth to be protected. Even now, generations later, that instinct remains. In the way locals politely turn their backs on researchers, in the way officials deny excavation permits near sacred mountains, in the way elders pause when asked too directly, letting the question hang unanswered in the air where it belongs. For those who listen closely, the silence speaks more clearly than words. It says, "This is not yours to find." It says, "He is part of the land now." It says, "Let him sleep." And still we search, not always with shovels or scanners, sometimes with stories, with theories, with dreams. We scan satellite images. We analyze soil composition. We trace the roots of ancient funeral processions recorded in myth and poetry. We follow every thread, hoping that one might lead us to the center. But the truth is, there may be no thread, or there may be thousands, or perhaps the real thread is the story itself, a circle with no beginning and no end. A story that asks us to slow down, to quiet our voices, to accept that some questions are not meant to close. Because Genghis Khan in life was a man of movement, of expansion, of change. But in death, he became stillness. He became a mystery that could not be chased, only circled. And there is a kind of wisdom in that, a lesson we rarely learn, that disappearance can be a gift. And so we find ourselves not at the edge of discovery, but at the center of a question that loops endlessly through the centuries, circling a place no one has seen and everyone imagines, differently. A quiet hillock, a grove of trees older than any living memory, a bend in the river where the water slows and deepens just slightly more than it should, or maybe no place at all, just a symbolic emptiness that calls out to something ancient inside us. This question lives in more than books or maps. It exists in the silence that falls over dinner tables when the topic is raised, in the wary glance of a herder who's been asked one too many times by outsiders with cameras and questions, in the footsteps that slow without reason while walking the highlands of Kentii, as if the air itself is heavier there, as if the very ground is protecting something. And it's in these moments, the slowing of the step, the deepening of the breath, the pause before speaking, that we feel we are closest to the answer. Not because we know it, but because we have learned to stop reaching for it. Because, in not knowing, we come to understand that Genghis Khan's disappearance was never about vanishing from history. It was about transforming into something untouchable. Not a figure, but a feeling. Not a monument, but a presence woven into the rhythm of wind and land and time. And this presence, precisely because it is untraceable, feels more enduring than anything built from stone, because stone crumbles, and names fade, and graves are desecrated, but a story protected by silence can echo forever. This is perhaps why the people of Mongolia, though proud of their history and their ancestors, have rarely expressed the need to excavate the past in the same way others do. They carry it instead in movement, in the way the yurts are set up facing east, in the way horses are treated with honor, in the way the old songs tell of storms and stars and long rides across an endless plain. Their history is not frozen behind glass, but breathing, shifting, alive in every gesture and every gust of steppe wind. And because of that, the location of the Khan's grave, whether truly known or simply believed to be unknowable, becomes not a destination, but a boundary. Not one meant to keep others out, but one meant to keep the mystery intact. To preserve a balance that has lasted for nearly a millennium, a balance between what is remembered and what is released. In the West, we often look to uncover, to document, to own knowledge. But in this story, we are asked to do the opposite, to listen without interrupting, to wonder without seizing, to accept that we may be standing atop the answer and never know it, and that this too is a kind of peace. And when we allow ourselves to feel that peace, not as resolution, but as presence, something begins to shift in how we view history itself. No longer as a chain of names and dates and places we can point to, but as something more fluid, more human, more fragile. A series of lives and choices and silences passed from voice to voice, never fully captured, only gently preserved. Genghis Khan's story, in this way, resists being finalized. His burial is not the end of his tale, but its most lasting mystery. The one detail left deliberately undone so that we, centuries later, would still be talking about it, still walking slowly through the grass, still imagining what it must have felt like to stand in that final moment of concealment. What does it mean that his grave has never been found? It means that somewhere along the line, people chose not to leave a mark. It means that instead of carving a memory into stone, they folded it into the land. And now, the land carries it forward, season after season, storm after storm, always beneath our feet and just beyond our reach. There is something deeply humbling about a world that still refuses to give up all its secrets. We often think of the past as something to be conquered, just like territory or disease or space, something we will one day fully chart and understand. But perhaps Genghis Khan's story reminds us that the past is not ours to own, that sometimes it belongs to itself and to the silence that shaped it. And maybe, if we listen carefully enough, we start to realize that this isn't just his story, it's ours too. Because the need to mark a grave is not just about remembering the dead, but about reassuring the living. It says, this life mattered. This person was real. But when the grave is gone, or never marked to begin with, we are left with something different. Not less real, but more mysterious, more open. It forces us to feel instead of know, to imagine instead of catalog. And in that space, we find something unexpected. Intimacy. not with the man himself, but with the people who carried him, who chose to leave no trace, who understood something we have mostly forgotten, that not all truths need to be spoken, to be true. And so we are left, not with a map, but with a moment that stretches across centuries, held in place by the quiet decision not to declare, not to reveal, not to claim. In the absence of a tomb, we are given something deeper, the reminder that reverence does not always need direction, that we can kneel in a field of wind-blown grass, in a country we've never seen, and still feel close to something greater than ourselves. We don't need coordinates to feel the weight of history. We don't need an inscription to understand legacy. Genghis Khan is not remembered because of a grave, but because of the way his life moved, and the way his people chose to end it. With care, with quiet, with loyalty so fierce it never turned to fame. And that, perhaps, is the most lasting empire of all, the invisible one, made not of land or laws, but of silence. A silence that lives on in the wind, in the footsteps that do not stop, in the riders who pass by and do not speak of what they may have seen. Somewhere, the grass grows a little thicker. Somewhere the trees stand a little taller. Somewhere, the earth remembers, and we, too, can remember, not by finding, but by accepting the gift of the unknown. The story continues, not in excavation, but in stillness, not in conclusion, but in presence. And as the stars rise again over the Mongolian steppe, and the world turns once more, slowly beneath their light, the grave remains, untouched, unseen, and eternal. There comes a time in every long and quiet story when the listener no longer waits for the ending, but begins to understand that the story itself, its rhythm, its pauses, its silences, is the destination. And in the mystery of Genghis Khan's burial, we have long since crossed that threshold, not toward solving, not toward revealing, but toward resting in the space the question makes, as if the uncertainty has become a kind of shelter, a soft-sided tent pitched in the open wind, wide enough to hold history, wonder, and stillness all at once. And in this 10th telling, this deep drift further into the folds of absence, we are not walking forward so much as settling in, sitting beside the old river of myth and fact that has carried this mystery so patiently for centuries, watching its slow waters shimmer without trying to dam them. For even now, after all we've explored, all we've remembered, all we've imagined, even now the mystery feels no smaller, no less sacred. It remains, not just because it is hidden, but because it is whole. The grave of Genghis Khan does not elude us because it is hard to find, but because it does not wish to be taken. And in that wish, there is a kind of truth greater than any artifact could give. We are meant to know this story not with the hands, but with the breath, slow, long, reverent, and to carry it not as evidence, but as a way of walking through the world, more quietly, more carefully, as if every hill might be sacred and every silence might be keeping a promise made long ago. And as we sit with this thought, not rushing it, not trying to shape it into something more concrete than it wants to be, we begin to realize that perhaps the grave itself is less a physical place and more a kind of echo, the resonance left behind by a life so immense, so expansive, that its end could not be bound by stone or soil, but instead had to fade into the very fabric of the steppe, like smoke rising into the sky, leaving behind no ashes, only the warmth of what once was. This is not how most great men are remembered, and that is precisely what makes it powerful. Because when a legacy depends on statues, on grand tombs and carved names, it is always at risk of erosion, of fire, of being broken or forgotten, or reduced to trivia. But when a legacy is carried in silence, in breath, in the way people still look toward a certain mountain and pause, then it lives longer. Genghis Khan may have conquered more land than any ruler in history, but his most enduring conquest may be this one, his choice to let his final resting place belong to no one. No state, no archive, no museum, only the land, the sky, the air, the things that do not forget, even when we no longer speak the names. Somewhere, if we are to believe the legends, his bones have returned to the earth. But everywhere, his silence has become a kind of presence, gentle, vast, and beyond reach. And maybe that is what a true burial means, not to be placed in a box and remembered with stone, but to become part of the story that can never fully be told, only felt. And so the story continues, not forward, but inward, spiraling slowly into the heart of something that has no center, only layers of meaning, each one softer than the last. The way an old tent folds in on itself when taken down, leaving behind only a ring of pressed grass and a memory of warmth. The more we consider this absence, the more it becomes clear that what has endured is not just the burial, but the idea of it, the deliberate act of surrendering a great life back to the land without drawing a line around it. There are many kinds of power in the world, but few are as quiet as the power to disappear so completely that you are never forgotten. Genghis Khan's grave, if it still exists in any shape, is not a relic waiting to be found, but a sacred refusal, a way of saying, even in death, that some things must remain untouched, unmeasured, unspoken. The world around us moves faster each year, consuming facts and footage and coordinates at speeds unimaginable to the men who once rode across the steppe. But the land where he rests, or may rest, does not move at that speed. It moves in seasons, in centuries, in shadows and clouds and wind. And the silence it holds is not a silence of loss, but of trust. Trust that we, too, might learn to leave some questions open, not because they are too difficult, but because they are too important to be solved. There comes a time in every long and quiet story when the listener no longer waits for the ending, but begins to understand that the story itself, its rhythm, its pauses, its silences, is the destination. And in the mystery of Genghis Khan's burial, we have long since crossed that threshold, not toward solving, not toward revealing, but toward resting in the space the question makes, as if the uncertainty has become a kind of shelter, a soft-sided tent pitched in the open wind, wide enough to hold history, wonder, and stillness all at once. And in this 10th telling, this deep drift further into the folds of absence, we are not walking forward so much as settling in, sitting beside the old river of myth and fact that has carried this mystery so patiently for centuries, watching its slow waters shimmer without trying to dam them. For even now, after all we've explored, all we've remembered, all we've imagined, even now the mystery feels no smaller, no less sacred. It remains, not just because it is hidden, but because it is whole. The grave of Genghis Khan does not elude us because it is hard to find, but because it does not wish to be taken. And in that wish, there is a kind of truth greater than any artifact could give. We are meant to know this story, not with the hands, but with the breath, slow, long, reverent, and to carry it not as evidence, but as a way of walking through the world, more quietly, more carefully, as if every hill might be sacred, and every silence might be keeping a promise made long ago. And as we sit with this thought, not rushing it, not trying to shape it into something more concrete than it wants to be, we begin to realize that perhaps the grave itself is less a physical place and more a kind of echo, the resonance left behind by a life so immense, so expansive, that its end could not be bound by stone or soil, but instead had to fade into the very fabric of the steppe, like smoke rising into the sky, leaving behind no ashes, only the warmth of what once was. This is not how most great men are remembered, and that is precisely what makes it powerful. Because when a legacy depends on statues, on grand tombs and carved names, it is always at risk of erosion, of fire, of being broken or forgotten, or reduced to trivia. But when a legacy is carried in silence, in breath, in the way people still look toward a certain mountain and pause, then it lives longer. Genghis Khan may have conquered more land than any ruler in history, but his most enduring conquest may be this one, his choice to let his final resting place belong to no one. No state, no archive, no museum, only the land, the sky, the air, the things that do not forget, even when we no longer speak the names. Somewhere, if we are to believe the legends, his bones have returned to the earth. But everywhere, his silence has become a kind of presence, gentle, vast, and beyond reach. And maybe that is what a true burial means. Not to be placed in a box and remembered with stone, but to become part of the story that can never fully be told, only felt. And so the story continues, not forward, but inward, spiraling slowly into the heart of something that has no center, only layers of meaning, each one softer than the last, the way an old tent folds in on itself when taken down, leaving behind only a ring of pressed grass and a memory of warmth. The more we consider this absence, the more it becomes clear that what has endured is not just the burial, but the idea of it, the deliberate act of surrendering a great life back to the land without drawing a line around it. There are many kinds of power in the world, but few are as quiet as the power to disappear so completely that you are never forgotten. Genghis Khan's grave, if it still exists in any shape, is not a relic waiting to be found, but a sacred refusal, a way of saying, even in death, that some things must remain untouched, unmeasured, unspoken. The world around us moves faster each year, consuming facts and footage and coordinates at speeds unimaginable to the men who once rode across the steppe. But the land where he rests, or may rest, does not move at that speed. It moves in seasons, in centuries, in shadows and clouds and wind. And the silence it holds is not a silence of loss, but of trust. Trust that we too might learn to leave some questions open, not because they are too difficult, but because they are too important to be solved. And when we allow ourselves to feel that peace, not as resolution, but as presence, something begins to shift in how we view history itself. No longer as a chain of names and dates and places we can point to, but as something more fluid, more human, more fragile. A series of lives and choices and silences passed from voice to voice, never fully captured, only gently preserved. Genghis Khan's story, in this way, resists being finalized. His burial is not the end of his tale, but its most lasting mystery. The one detail left deliberately undone so that we, centuries later, would still be talking about it, still walking slowly through the grass, still imagining what it must have felt like to stand in that final moment of concealment. What does it mean that his grave has never been found? It means that somewhere along the line, people chose not to leave a mark. It means that instead of carving a memory into stone, they folded it into the land. And now, the land carries it forward. Season after season, storm after storm, always beneath our feet and just beyond our reach. There is something deeply humbling about a world that still refuses to give up all its secrets. We often think of the past as something to be conquered, just like territory or disease or space, something we will one day fully chart and understand. But perhaps Genghis Khan's story reminds us that the past is not ours to own, that sometimes it belongs to itself and to the silence that shaped it. And maybe, if we listen carefully enough, we start to realize that this isn't just his story, it's ours too. Because the need to mark a grave is not just about remembering the dead, but about reassuring the living. It says, this life mattered. This person was real. But when the grave is gone, or never marked to begin with, we are left with something different, not less real, but more mysterious, more open. It forces us to feel instead of know, to imagine instead of catalog, and in that space we find something unexpected: intimacy. Not with the man himself, but with the people who carried him, who chose to leave no trace, who understood something we have mostly forgotten: that not all truths need to be spoken to be true. And so we are left, not with a map, but with a moment that stretches across centuries, held in place by the quiet decision not to declare, not to reveal, not to claim. In the absence of a tomb, we are given something deeper: the reminder that reverence does not always need direction, that we can kneel in a field of wind-blown grass, in a country we've never seen, and still feel close to something greater than ourselves. We don't need coordinates to feel the weight of history. We don't need an inscription to understand legacy. Genghis Khan is not remembered because of a grave, but because of the way his life moved, and the way his people chose to end it. With care, with quiet, with loyalty so fierce it never turned to fame. And that, perhaps, is the most lasting empire of all, the invisible one, made not of land or laws, but of silence. A silence that lives on in the wind, in the footsteps that do not stop, in the riders who pass by and do not speak of what they may have seen. Somewhere, the grass grows a little thicker. Somewhere, the trees stand a little taller. Somewhere, the earth remembers. And we too can remember, not by finding, but by accepting the gift of the unknown. The story continues, not in excavation, but in stillness, not in conclusion, but in presence. And as the stars rise again over the Mongolian, step, and the world turns once more, slowly beneath their light, the grave remains, untouched, unseen, and eternal. To continue down the quiet path of this story is not to move closer to a solution, but to sink more fully into the nature of the mystery itself. For the burial of Genghis Khan is not just a forgotten detail of the past, not merely an unsolved question lying in wait for the right combination of tools and luck, but rather something greater, something slower and deeper, like the flow of a river too wide to see all at once. Its surface smooth and unhurried, but its weight dragging the very shape of the world beneath it. And as we move into this 11th part of the telling, the silence that surrounds that burial no longer feels like an obstacle to overcome, but a landscape to dwell in, a great plain of absence that stretches out in every direction, wind-blown and patient, holding time the way the earth holds roots, with no need to explain or define. Genghis Khan, that most relentless of conquerors, did not simply vanish from the world. He was deliberately returned to it, reabsorbed by the land that raised him, hidden not to deceive but to honor, buried not in secrecy but in sacredness, his grave not lost but kept, by wind and soil, by tradition and belief, by those who understood that the measure of a life does not lie in the monument it leaves behind, but in the space it makes inside those who remember. We live in an age of certainty, of search engines and coordinates, of satellites that scan the surface of the earth with relentless precision, and yet even now, with all that light cast upon the world, there remains this one place, unnamed, unmarked, unspoken, where the past has chosen to lie down and not rise again, where a story ends not in punctuation, but in breath. Perhaps it lies beneath a hill, no different from the hundreds that surround it, its grass slightly taller in summer, its snow slightly deeper in winter, but otherwise indistinct, offering no hint of the weight it carries beneath. Or perhaps it is gone entirely, not in the sense of being destroyed, but in the sense of having passed beyond the need for physical shape. Its wood long rotted, its stone weathered to dust, its body returned to root and worm and rain, until even the bones have forgotten they were once a man. And yet we speak of it still. We wonder. We map. We dream. We imagine walking there, unknowingly perhaps, standing with a thermos in hand, listening to the quiet murmur of insects or the rustle of wind through dry reeds, unaware that just beneath our feet lies the most carefully guarded secret of the medieval world. And would it matter, really, to know for sure? To place a flag, to name a location, to drive a post into the ground and say, here he lies? Or would that act, that need to fix and define, to pin the mystery like a butterfly to a board, be a kind of failure, not of history, but of imagination? For what does it mean to truly honor a man like Genghis Khan, whose name once made kings tremble, whose armies reached farther than any before or since, who reshaped the world in fire and treaty and blood, and yet whose final request was not for a pyramid or a throne, but for silence? His grave, wherever it lies, is more than a resting place. It is a lesson. It is a mirror. It is the line he drew, not across a map, but across our understanding of memory, asking us not to find, but to feel, not to seek, but to respect. And in that respect, we find something rare, the willingness to let part of the story remain untold. That decision, made by those who buried him and passed that silence down through centuries, is perhaps the most human moment in the entire saga. An act not of conquest, but of restraint, a refusal to turn his death into spectacle, a recognition that even the greatest lives deserve peace. And so we walk beside that restraint, step by quiet step, through the centuries that followed, watching how that silence held its shape even as empires fell and borders changed, even as scholars debated, and maps shifted, even as explorers brought spades and scanners and promises of discovery into the sacred landscapes of the Khenti Mountains, only to be turned back, gently or firmly, not always by force, but by something deeper, a feeling, a hush, a collective intuition that here, in this space, the old story still sleeps, and waking it would be the wrong kind of triumph. Because there are triumphs that come with uncovering, and there are triumphs that come with leaving well enough alone, and the people who have lived among these hills and rivers and forests for generations seem to know which is which. The grave has never been looted, never been displayed, never been reduced to an exhibit in a glass case or a destination on a travel itinerary. And this is not because it cannot be found, but because, at least in some quiet hearts, it already has been. And the finding meant standing still and saying nothing. That kind of knowledge, the kind that asks to be kept, is almost alien to us now. We live in a world that rewards revelation, that praises the first to post, the first to publish, the first to drill beneath the surface and claim the truth. But this story resists that rhythm. It asks something older of us, to listen, to imagine, to accept that not every grave must be opened, not every mystery must end in evidence. And in that way, the burial of Genghis Khan becomes not just a question of history, but a meditation on how we carry the past. Do we seek to possess it, or to walk beside it? Do we mine it for answers, or do we let it shape our questions? For the people who buried him, the act was never about hiding something from the world, but about returning him to it, not as a body or a legend, but as part of the land, the wind, the pattern of stars overhead. And if you've ever stood beneath those stars on a clear night in Mongolia, far from the lights of cities, where the sky is so deep it feels like it might spill open and draw you into it, then you understand why they believed the sacred could not be named, only felt. In that sky, in that hush, in that impossible quiet, the story continues. Not with new facts, not with sudden discovery, but with the long, slow deepening of presence. A presence that grows not louder, but more still. And maybe that's the real answer we've been circling all along. That the grave is not a point on a map, but a way of being with what we do not know. that the greatest tomb ever built was not made of stone, but of silence. And that silence, carried faithfully through generations, still holds. It holds because it was never broken. It holds because we, despite ourselves, have learned to honor it. And so the land remains, unchanged and undefiled, its grasses bending under the same wind that once carried messages across continents, its trees rising slowly where once men stood and did not speak. The secret is there, if it is anywhere, folded into the rhythm of earth and air and time. But the gift, the real gift, is that we do not need to find it to understand. The secret has already done its work. It has slowed us down. It has made us listen. It has reminded us that not everything grand must be displayed, that not every king needs a crown in death, that sometimes the truest legacy is not what is shown, but what is quietly kept. The longer we sit with this story, the more it ceases to feel like a mystery and begins instead to feel like a presence, not something lost, but something waiting, patient and deliberate, older than memory and deeper than knowledge. A presence, not in the form of a monument or a name etched into stone, but in the shape of the silence itself, in the way the question continues to drift like morning mist over the steppes of Mongolia, never settling, never dispersing, simply lingering. And it is in that lingering that we begin to understand the true weight of what was buried, not just a body, but a philosophy, not just a conqueror, but a belief in a kind of reverence that our modern world has nearly forgotten. The reverence for not knowing, for leaving a thing undisturbed, for allowing it to remain part of the land in which it rests. Because to search for the grave of Genghis Khan is to confront something ancient and unyielding, something that does not want to be owned or uncovered, not out of malice, not from fear, but from a kind of wisdom that whispers, "I am here, and that is enough." And so, the silence continues to hold, not because we lack the tools to break it, but because those tools, the drones, the satellite imagery, the pattern recognition software, the analysis of faint trails and forgotten rumors, seem to slip like water over stone when they meet the deeper truth of this mystery, which is not a matter of geography but of grace. For even in this world of relentless exposure, where every unknown is chased and every secret pulled toward the surface, Genghis Khan remains where he chose to be. In the earth, beneath no marker, beneath no map, beneath only the endless sky, whose stars continue their slow dance each night over a land that has forgotten nothing and revealed little. And so the land continues to hold him, or perhaps simply the idea of him, in a way no monument ever could, with grasses that return each spring as they always have, with rivers that carry meltwater down from mountains older than any empire, with winds that pass through the same valleys and over the same stones that may have once felt the tremble of hooves or the passing of a funeral. Procession moving quietly beneath the moon, wrapped in solemnity, silence, and dust. These are not just symbols. They are the living record of a story that chose not to be written down in marble, but allowed itself to become part of the breathing world. If there is a grave, it does not announce itself. It does not wish to. It rests beneath the surface of things, of soil, of memory, of the need to understand. And perhaps that is why, after so many years, we still find ourselves walking these paths in thought, returning again and again to the same question. Not because we expect an answer, but because the question has become a way of remembering, of participating in something too large to be held in one place. For Genghis Khan was never meant to end where he began, not in a specific valley or mountain or field, but in the collective memory of all those who wonder, all those who listen, all those who accept that some truths do not wish to be named. In this way, his grave becomes not a thing to be found, but a lesson in letting go, not of history, but of our need to define its edges. And so the story continues, as it always has, not forward, not backward, but inward, deeper into silence, deeper into presence, deeper into the space between knowledge and reverence, where a man can become a myth, not because he vanished, but because he chose to. There is something that changes in the way a person breathes when they begin to understand that not every story is meant to conclude, not every question must be answered, and not every silence needs to be broken, and that understanding lies at the heart of the mystery surrounding Genghis Khan's burial. For as we continue to drift deeper into this story, not as seekers of truth but as companions of silence, we find ourselves slowing in thought and pace, as though even our wondering must become quieter, gentler, more reverent, as though to think too loudly might disturb the delicate balance that has preserved this secret for nearly 800 years. It's no longer about maps or guesses or old scrolls with half-faded directions. It's about what it means that a man of such colossal influence, whose very breath once altered the fate of kingdoms, chose to leave this world without a trace, without a marker, without a word left carved into the face of time. And that choice, so profoundly different from the towering mausoleums and grand tombs of other emperors, tells us more about who he was and how he understood life and death than any history book ever could. His was not a life meant to be entombed in a monument, frozen in stone for future tourists to pass by with cameras and audio guides. His was a life so tied to the land that the land itself became his grave. Not one hill, not one valley, but the whole of Mongolia, from the whispering grasses to the snow that gathers on distant ridges, from the ancient birches to the stars that return each night to trace the shape of the sky his people knew as eternal. And so, his story persists not in granite or gold, but in this strange and sacred space between fact and faith, where we are invited not to discover, but to imagine, not to trespass, but to dwell beside. For even now, long after his empire has dissolved into the names of other countries, other nations, other flags, there remains a thread that connects those who walk the step to the man who once did the same, not because of a marked grave, but because of a continued silence, respected still, carried still, and protected still by those who do not see history as something to be owned, but something to be honored. And in that honor, there is no room for excavation or celebration, only for watching the wind move across a field and wondering if it remembers, for hearing a distant bird cry in the forest and wondering if it echoes through time, for standing on a piece of ground with no knowledge of what lies below and feeling, without needing to say it, that something important is here, not visible, not documented, but deeply, unquestionably present. This is the nature of a true mystery. Not that it refuses to be solved, but that it offers us something far more rare, the opportunity to sit beside the unknown without the need to conquer it. And that opportunity is fading from the world, where knowledge is so often mistaken for wisdom, where answers are mistaken for understanding, where silence is mistaken for emptiness. But in the story of Genghis Khan's burial, silence is the message, absence is the form, and what is missing is the most enduring presence of all. It's not just that the grave has never been found, it's that in not being found, it has continued to shape how we see him, not as a relic of war and empire, but as something softer now, something closer to myth, not because he is unreal, but because he is still protected, still unwritten, still kept, and perhaps that is what he wanted. Not to be visited, but to be remembered by not being disturbed, to be known by the quietness of a world that once bore his weight and now holds his rest. It is a different kind of immortality, one not built with the tools of civilization, but with the breath of a people who knew how to remember without speaking, how to keep something sacred simply by never letting it become ordinary. So when we speak of his grave, we do not speak of coordinates or landmarks, but of a hush that still lingers across an entire land, of a stillness that folds itself around those who listen long enough, of a story that does not end, but only deepens, the longer we choose not to interrupt it. And in that deepening, we find peace, not because we found him, but because we have learned why we never will. There are stories that move forward like rivers, always searching for a conclusion, always carving through the landscape toward the sea of certainty. And then there are stories like this one, stories that do not flow outward, but settle inward, that do not arrive at an end, but deepen with each step, like walking through fog that only grows more beautiful the less you try to reach the other side. And the story of Genghis Khan's burial is just such a story. Not because it is complicated, but because it is simple in the way the earth is simple. Still, whole, impossible to hold, and yet beneath every step. And the further we go into this telling, the more it feels as though the grave we seek is not a fixed point beneath soil or snow, but a space inside us where wonder and stillness meet, where the need to know and the willingness to let go sit beside each other like old friends. And perhaps that is what those who buried him understood, not in theory, but in the marrow of their lives. That a man like Genghis, who spent his entire existence reshaping the world by force of will, needed a kind of death that did the opposite, one that required surrender, humility, disappearance, a return not to ceremony but to silence, not to empire, but to earth. That silence has held for nearly 800 years, not because no one tried to break it, but because those who could have broken it never wanted to. And that difference matters, because it means the secret of the grave is not just a mystery, but a kind of wisdom, passed down not through maps or texts, but through restraint, the most forgotten form of knowledge in the modern world. And so we come to understand that this isn't just about a location lost in the wilds of Mongolia. It's about how a people made a decision to protect something greater than a man. They protected the idea that not everything powerful must be visible, that not everything sacred must be touched, and that not everything true must be proved. There are rumors, of course, as there always are. Some say he was buried near the Onon River. Others say beneath the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun. Still others claim his funeral procession killed every witness, that the grave was trampled by horses, that trees were planted to cover it, or that an entire river was redirected to wash away the site. But all of these stories, even if conflicting, share one quiet center. They are acts of protection, not concealment. And that distinction reshapes how we hear them, because this was not about hiding a treasure or obscuring a truth. It was about preserving an absence that could speak louder than a monument. In that absence, we find something we rarely encounter in history. The freedom to imagine, not recklessly, but reverently, the way you might imagine the breath of someone sleeping nearby in the dark, not to wake them, but just to feel that they're still with you. Maybe that's what we're really doing when we speak of this mystery again and again. Maybe we're not trying to solve it. Maybe we're trying to keep it close, to keep him close, in the only way that still honors the choice he made, and by not disturbing it. Because if the grave were to be found, what then? What would we do with it? Photograph it? Excavate it? Build a glass enclosure and a placard in a parking lot? Or would something vital be lost in the very act of discovery, as if by naming the place we broke the spell? And the silence that had lasted longer than any kingdom turned to noise, not in celebration, but in grief. And maybe the land knows this, and that's why it keeps its secret. Not because it's stubborn, but because it's faithful. Faithful to the story. Faithful to the man. Faithful to the idea that not every answer belongs in the open. So we keep circling the mystery, not in frustration, but in awe, letting it grow larger instead of smaller, older instead of solved. Letting it teach us the strange and necessary lesson that the unknown is not our enemy, but a form of grace. And in that grace, we hear a different kind of story. One not told with battles and treaties and maps, but with breath, with pause, with the knowledge that somewhere out there, or perhaps in all places at once, the man who once ruled the greatest land empire the world has ever known sleeps without a name over him. And the world, despite all our searching, has learned to let him rest. There are moments in every long story when it no longer feels like a tale being told, but a place one inhabits, when the words stop moving forward like steps and instead settle into the ground beneath you. And that's what happens as we enter even deeper into this mystery. The weight of it no longer in the unanswered question, but in the atmosphere. The question creates, as if merely thinking about Genghis Khan's burial shifts the air, thickens the silence, turns the land in your mind into something older, something still carrying the breath of men who walked before history wrote anything down, who did not mark with ink or stone, but with silence, with directionless steps across open earth, carrying something heavy and sacred with them, not because it was a body, but because it was a decision, a covenant between a man and the world he helped shape, that when he returned to it, he would not demand glory, only peace, not recognition, only disappearance. And so, here we are, centuries later, still talking about a man we cannot find, and it's in that inability that we learn what this story was meant to be. Not a problem to solve, not a treasure to uncover, but a meditation on presence through absence, on how something that cannot be touched can still press against the soul with the weight of reverence. There are those who still search, of course, those with drones and funding and the quiet, breathless hope of being the one to put a pin in the map and say, "Here, finally, this is where he sleeps." But the truth is, every search begins with a misunderstanding, with the idea that the burial is a location rather than a choice. And every failure to find it is not a failure of tools, but a refusal of the land to betray what it was asked to hold, and hold forever. Maybe his grave lies beneath trees that now seem ordinary, or beneath rocks weathered by time into nothing more than scenery. Maybe there is no grave left, and all that once was has long ago rejoined the cycle of rain and root and wind. Or maybe, and this is the thought that haunts and comforts at once, maybe there is no single place, and the men who buried him, loyal beyond fear, divided his remains into 100 paths, each one ending in a silence no different than the others. A network of unmarked resting places, each as sacred and unknowable as the last, so that not even they could remember the whole of him. If this is true, then what we are left with is not a single lost tomb, but a landscape made holy by the act of forgetting, an empire of soil and shadow stitched together not by roads, but by the absence of them. And in that idea, strange as it may be, there is comfort, because it means that he is not simply missing, but everywhere the dust of him caught in the grass, the hush of him hovering in the stillness before storms, the memory of him carried not by scholars or scientists, but by silence itself. And what does that teach us, truly? But that legacy does not need to be seen to be real. We are so used to graves that announce themselves, to stone that insists it be read, to memory that demands to be measured. And yet, here is a memory that has lasted longer than most, because it was never given shape, never offered to be held, only protected by those who knew that the most powerful thing about a story can be the part it refuses to reveal. This is not the kind of history that fits neatly in a classroom or a documentary voiceover. It's the kind you feel when walking alone, when the wind suddenly dies and the world goes quiet in a way that suggests listening, not from above, but from below. And in that moment, you understand why this story still matters. Because it is not just about him, it's about us, and how we choose to live with the unknown. Whether we respect it, whether we let it be, whether we allow something, just one thing, to remain untouched in a world that touches and takes everything. That is the grave. That is the burial. That is the answer we are not meant to find but to live beside, and in doing so, become part of the silence ourselves. And so if we are to carry anything forward from this long and winding silence, from this story that never allowed itself to be concluded in stone or confirmed in coordinates, it must be this: that there is still power in not knowing, still dignity in mystery, still something deeply human in the decision to step back, to look across the hills and rivers and endless plains and say, "Let this be." Because in a world that archives everything, that names and tracks and documents and reveals, the story of Genghis Khan's burial stands apart, not as something forgotten, but as something fiercely remembered by being withheld, preserved, not by glass or guards or historical commissions, but by a kind of reverence that lives only where people choose silence over spectacle, stillness over celebration. And maybe that's what truly endures about this mystery. Not the hope of discovering a tomb, but the quiet awe that arises in the face of something so carefully left alone. It is that feeling, not just curiosity but respect, that continues to ripple through time, just as the Khan's empire once did, not by force now, but by invitation, inviting us to slow down, to imagine, to wonder, to walk with softer steps, and ask ourselves what it means to be remembered rightly. Because for all the destruction and conquest that Genghis Khan unleashed upon the world, for all the cities that burned, and the dynasties that bent before him, he ended not as a monument to domination, but as an idea of return, of giving oneself back to the land that gave them breath. His burial, then, is not an absence, but a presence too large to be captured in a chamber or marked by a plaque. It is the breath of wind across tall grass, the creak of a saddle beneath a rider who says nothing, the hush of the mountains that were once asked to keep a secret, and still do. The more we speak of it, the clearer it becomes that the grave is not what we're looking for. What we're really searching for, whether we know it or not, is a different relationship to the past, one not built on exposure or conquest, but on mutuality, on care, on knowing when not to look further. We search for his resting place as if its discovery might complete the story, but perhaps the story has always been complete. Complete in the way a circle is, with no break, no beginning or end, just a constant turning, a cycle of wondering and honoring and wondering again. And in that turning, we are not outside the story, not looking in from the present toward the past, but within it, carried along just like the winds that still sweep the steppe, touching the grass, bending the trees, and stirring something ancient in the hearts of those who listen. And so the question remains, but it remains gently now, no longer burning with urgency, no longer demanding resolution, but resting instead, like the man himself, somewhere beneath the earth, or the sky, or the story itself, where no spade has broken the ground, and no foot has dared claim what was left to sleep. Perhaps that is the lesson. Perhaps all along, this has been about how we treat what we cannot name. Do we chase it? Do we mine it? Or do we, just once, let it be the one thing we protect simply by never touching it? That is the final act of this long journey, not to find the grave, but to understand why it was never meant to be found. And in that understanding, something opens, something soft and wide and older than empire, something that asks nothing of us but patience, a kind of peace, a kind of ending, a kind of beginning. And somewhere, far beyond the edge of knowing, beneath a sky that has not changed, Genghis Khan is still there, not waiting, not hiding, just part of the land now, held by silence, and held still by us. And now, we leave the story where it began, not with an answer, but with silence. The same silence that has held for centuries. The same silence that drifts across the grasslands, carried by wind, guarded by hills, untouched by time. Somewhere out there, or everywhere, the man they called the Great Khan is still at rest. No stone marks the spot. No map reveals the way. And that, perhaps, is his final legacy. Not conquest, not empire, but stillness, a kind of peace we rarely grant to those who lived greatly. So we end not with discovery, but with reverence. We end with quiet, with breath, with the understanding that some stories are not ours to solve, only to remember. And as you drift, now into sleep, may the silence of this mystery stay with you, soft as a whisper, vast as the sky, and eternal as the land that keeps its promise.